Welcome, everyone, to the Center for Information Technology Policy seminar series. I am Andrew Appel, professor of computer science at Princeton and member of the Center for Information Technology Policy. I am happy to introduce our speaker today, Vanessa Teague. Vanessa received her PhD from Stanford in 2005, doing a combination of cryptography, game theory, and distributed algorithms. And then until earlier this year, she was associate professor at the University of Melbourne. She now runs her own cybersecurity practice and is an adjunct professor at the Australian National University. She's done a variety of work in the overlap between security, privacy, and technology policy. In 2017, she showed that the data set provided by the Australian Medicare benefits system could be de-anonymized. In 2018, she found a privacy flaw in the New Zealand census data. In 2019, she found a security flaw in the Swiss internet voting system, which is one of the things she'll be talking about today. She's on the board of advisors of the Verified Voting Foundation, and she has received the Election Integrity Research Excellent Award from the Election Verification Network. So welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you, Andrew. So it's a big responsibility to begin.
To interrupt, but let me interrupt. So if you have a question, the audience members who have a question can type it into the Q&A window, or you can raise your hand and I may be able to enable you to ask your question live in audio. Go ahead.
Terrific. Thank you very much for having me to the Center for Information Technology Policy. It's a very big and exciting week to be giving a talk about election integrity. So here's my best effort. I'm going to talk about two different election integrity problems that I've worked on, one of which turns out to be much easier than we thought, and one of which turns out to be harder every time we think about it. The first one is risk limiting audits for instant runoff voting, and the second one is internet voting. So let's start with what elections are supposed to be for. I'm going to start with this wonderful quote from Dan Wallach. He says, "The challenge with any voting system is to provide sufficient evidence to convince the loser that he or she lost." Now, I think we've possibly seen this year that this requirement might be a little bit too strong, but that's kind of okay because it may not be necessary. What's necessary, I think, and I think Dan has expanded on this in more recent times, is the challenge is to provide sufficient evidence to convince enough of the loser's supporters that person lost. So this seems prophetic and I think highly relevant to what's happening in the United States at the moment. And if we think about the evidence provided to support an American election result, we've seen tremendous progress. I graduated and left the United States in 2004. And a couple of years after that, the verification map of the United States looked like this. There were a very large number of people voting on entirely electronic systems with no paper backup. There were even some people still using lever machines, which was a thing I'd never even heard of before I came to the United States. In 2020, the map looks like this, which is enormously better. And I'm told that even in those states which look 100% red, that is, look like it's 100% electronic machines with no paper record, this year, actually, ironically, because of the pandemic, a lot of people voted by mail, which may not be the best voting system in terms of an evidence trail, but is an awful lot better than a paperless electronic machine. Not because vote by mail fraud is impossible, but because the magnitude of fraud that a small conspiracy can undetectably commit is relatively limited compared to the amount of fraud possible with a set of electronic machines that make no evidence at all. So just to go back to 2006 so that you can see the trend, although the 2020 map isn't perfect, the trend from 2006 to 2020 is hugely positive. And I think one of the things that I really want to say in this talk is that 15 years of work by all kinds of Americans, lawyers, technologists, electoral officials, legislators, to improve the evidence trail built to support a US election has paid off this year. It didn't happen accidentally. It happened because lots of people, every single one of those little squares that's changed from red to green or orange to green is the work of somebody who made a decision to work on improving the integrity of their electoral system. Okay, so here's the first of my two technical problems. The first half of my talk is going to be about the surprising tractability of risk limiting audits for instant runoff voting. I imagine that there are probably a quarter of the audience already knows exactly what instant runoff voting is, and the other 3/4 probably doesn't care, but here's the picture anyway. The idea of instant runoff voting is that rather than choosing your one favorite candidate, you choose a sequence of preferences. You know, this person is my favorite candidate, this person is my second favorite, this person is my third favorite, and so on. And the counting progresses in the following way. First, we tally up all the first preferences. And if somebody gets a majority, they win. Not a plurality, but a strict majority of the votes that were cast. If nobody's got more than 50%, we look at the candidate with the lowest tally. We pull all their ballots out of the pile and we redistribute their ballots according to the next preference on that vote. And we just keep doing this until somebody gets a majority. So that's IRV. It is the normal voting method throughout Australia, and I gather it is increasingly in use in the United States, including San Francisco, Berkeley, and some places on the East Coast are considering it too. Risk limiting audits, again, I assume that many people already know what this is about. The idea is that if you think about an election system with some kind of ground truth, typically in paper ballots, and also some kind of electronic count that claims to accurately represent the ground truth, but has not necessarily been generated in a perfectly trustworthy way, a risk limiting audit gives us a way of checking the announced election result against the ground truth in the paper ballots. And it either gives us solid evidence that the announced election outcome is right, or if that evidence is found to be unconvincing or lacking, it reverts to a full hand count to correct the record. So the risk limit is just the largest chance that the audit will accept a wrong outcome, which obviously we try to make very small. And there's a reference there by Philip Stark and Mark Lindemann. So a risk limiting audit is, I think, one of the huge success stories of election integrity, both in the US and in the rest of the world over the last couple of decades, although they're not commonly used outside the United States. They're still a brilliant idea. There are a whole lot of details, both statistical and procedural, that really, really matter. And a whole lot of very hardworking statisticians, including Philip Stark and a few others, have been working very, very hard for many, many years to figure out what you do in various complicated circumstances that actually arise in practice. Also, I learned when I started looking at the San Francisco pilot, which I'll describe in a minute, that American elections are just unbelievably complicated. And there are so many important details about actually making an RLA work that I didn't even know I didn't know. For example, that a vote doesn't always fit on one piece of, a person's ballot doesn't always fit on one piece of paper. So when you go fishing for the piece of paper, you don't know whether you're getting the piece of paper that had that race on it or not. And all kinds of details that actually have to be worked through. So anyway, for a long time, risk limiting audits were the gold standard, but it was believed that instant runoff voting was so unstable and impossible to understand and incomprehensible, that true rigorous risk limiting audits were not possible or were not likely to be feasible. This turns out to be false. So we can do risk limiting audits for IRV. And the idea is, so this is a teamwork between me, Philip and some other statisticians, and Michelle Blom and Peter Stuckey, who are constraint optimization specialists. So the tricky thing about IRV, of course, is that if you do your IRV iterative elimination and you end up with 2 candidates who are the last 2 candidates standing, you do not necessarily know that the person who seems to be the almost winner is actually the true runner-up. You do not really know that there wasn't some other elimination earlier in the sequence that, in fact, if it had been manipulated or flicked, would have cascaded into a completely different election outcome and thus produced a completely different winner. So it's very hard to compute. It's not obvious at all how you compute the margin, and it's not obvious at all how you audit the winner without necessarily obviously knowing who the runner-up is. We could audit every single step of the elimination sequence, but that's overkill, and that's likely to be a completely infeasible kind of audit because there were probably some very close comparisons early in the elimination order that would actually be very hard to test because they're very close, but also actually don't need to be tested because they don't make any difference. So the key idea here is that we look at all of the full preference lists of all of the votes, and we analyze them to see which comparisons we really need to test and which ones we don't need to bother testing because they don't change the answer. And we come up with a minimal set of assertions that allow us to exclude all of the possibilities where somebody else wins. Not every other elimination order. We don't care about the elimination order. We just care about making sure that we've got the right winner. So we tried this out in San Francisco. This is a pilot audit of just to see whether the process makes sense and the numbers are reasonable. And we looked at the San Francisco district attorney's race, which if you know a little bit about San Francisco, you might know was quite fraught and very closely contested. It turned out that when we looked, we were looking only at the vote by mail ballots, and it turned out that actually the winner of the vote by mail ballots was different from the winner of the overall election result because people who showed up and voted in a polling place voted differently from people who voted by mail. But anyway, it was a very, it was actually a very good test of the feasibility of risk limiting audits because it was very close. We ended up getting a statistical confidence much higher, a risk much lower than the 0.05 risk limit that we had set, even after sampling only 200 ballots. So just to give you a rough idea of how this works, this is there were 4 candidates in this race, and Susan, I think it was Susan Loftus, was the winner of the vote by mail ballots. This diagram shows you all possible elimination orders for all 4 candidates who stood. The leaf at each tree is the first candidate who gets eliminated, and the root of each tree is the person who won. The red line indicates the apparent outcome. That is the thing you get if you just count the vote by mail ballots. Douch gets eliminated first, then Tung, then Bodown and Loftus are left as the last 2, and Loftus wins. So what we need to do if we're going to audit this apparent outcome is figure out how to eliminate every path on every other tree other than the ones in which Loftus wins. So our analysis for each tree, this is the Douch tree, it finds a set of assertions that are going to be relatively easy to test for things that cannot happen that allow us to prune the tree. So these assertions IRV 4, 7, 9, and 10 will be a specific statement that say such and such a candidate couldn't possibly have fewer votes than this other candidate at this point, and therefore couldn't possibly be eliminated at this point. And once you've audited an assertion like that to check whether or not it's really true, you can prune that part of the tree. And if you've pruned every possible elimination sequence in a tree, then you can show that the person at the root of that tree couldn't possibly have won. Okay, so, and obviously we have to do this for all three of the trees for three other winners, Douch, Tung, and Budan. Okay, so the code for digitizing the ballots is some proprietary thing from some private vendor, but all the code for opening the outcome is completely open source. So this software could support a full process in which all of any citizen can observe the whole process of the audit. And obviously there are a lot of other important details that I've left out, like having to be able to observe the fair generation of randomness, having to be able to observe that the paper ballots that were retrieved were indeed the correct ones, and so forth. But they can use the code to check the calculations for themselves. And you can try it yourself at the following two links if you would like. Okay, I don't know whether I should pause for questions at the end of that. I might pause for questions about that being the end of the first segment. Does anyone want to jump in and ask about that? We'll also have questions at the end, I should say.
So how many ballots were cast in the whole election? Do you approximately?
Yeah, that's a really good question. How many ballots were cast in the whole election? I think some tens of thousands. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head.
And 200 had to be examined in the audit?
Correct. Well, 200 were examined in the audit. It turned out I think we predicted that we would need about 180 something in order to meet the 0.05 risk limit. But the electoral authorities decided to just grab 200 so that they could be more confident they wouldn't need to escalate. And it turned out that 200 was plenty.
And how long did that process take?
Well, so remember, this was just a process pilot. So we actually didn't do the public generation of the randomness and the public selection of the ballots. In fact, the San Francisco authorities gathered the ballots before the auditing day. And I gather that it took quite a few hours for people to go. I wasn't there, but I gather it took quite a few hours for people to go and find those 200 pieces of paper.
And I'll ask one more question. There are some kinds of risk limiting audit methods where that number 180 that you have to sample wouldn't be much different if it were 1 million ballots instead of tens of thousands. Is that generally the case with these instant runoff voting audits?
Yes. So the underlying maths in terms of the audit estimation and the statistics is actually very, very similar to whatever kind of audit you're using to do those two-party comparisons when you're pruning the tree. So yes, exactly what you said is true. It's more or less independent of the total number of votes, but it does depend, of course, very much on the margin. I should say this, by the way, was a ballot level comparison audit. It is possible to apply these techniques to a ballot polling audit, but as with first past the post audits, the ballot comparison audits are much more efficient in terms of the relatively small sample size that you can take.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, there's a question, can you put the GitHub links in the chat? I think that's sort of inconvenient to do in the middle of the talk, but maybe.
Yeah, I can do it at the end though.
All right, why don't you continue?
Okay, so the next half of my talk is about internet voting. And I think, what can I say? As a general thing, every time we look at internet voting, we understand a new thing that makes it even harder than we thought. And there's literature about internet voting going back 20 years. And it seems like a fun idea if you don't think about it hard enough, because it seems like, it seems like a cute cryptography problem, right? We could invent for ourselves a nifty cryptographic protocol that would kind of protect privacy and also provide some evidence. And it seems easy. It seems easy to write a paper about. But the more we learn about it, and particularly the more we learn about trying to make it work for real people actually voting in a real election, the more we uncover new things that don't work and new potential kinds of very, very serious failures that were not part of the attack model when the author wrote their nifty scientific paper about their clever cryptographic protocol. So I'm going to talk about one particular kind of failure. And then I'm going to summarize at the end with a very, very long list of the other kinds of failures that most of the scientific community didn't think of when we were writing our papers about internet voting. So this is joint work with Thomas Haynes, Sarah Jamie Lewis, and Olivier Pereira. We looked at the code for the Swiss internet voting system. And this Swiss internet voting system was supposed to include 2 non-interactive zero knowledge proofs for 2 very important facts about the election. Both of them related to the kind of back-end processing of the vote. The first one was that there were some servers, they were supposed to shuffle the encrypted votes. And obviously, as soon as you have a server shuffling the encrypted votes, you can see immediately that there's a serious risk that that server, or whoever breaks into that server, has the potential to manipulate those votes at scale. Because if that server maliciously adds or drops or modifies ballots, then we're in big trouble. So this system was supposed to have a mathematical proof that it had shuffled accurately. So it had changed the appearance of the votes, but it hadn't changed the set of plain texts of the encrypted votes. This proof turned out to be buggy, and we showed that it was possible for a malicious party to manipulate the votes while providing a completely convincing looking proof that they hadn't manipulated any votes. And similarly, we found a similar kind of serious problem in the decryption part, where a malicious party could decrypt falsely, claim that the ciphertext was actually complete nonsense when in fact it had been valid, and yet provide a completely convincing proof that passed verification that everything was fine. So here's an example. And again, there's a link here, which I will paste in the chat at the end of the discussion. We made a series of examples demonstrating that our fake proofs would pass the verification in the test code and in the specification. This is the most simple example because obviously it's encrypted with not real randomness, just to show you. We built a proof that the set of votes on the left can be truthfully shuffled into the votes on the right, when you can see that that is obviously not true, because we've got 4 times 149 on the left and 4 times 5,000 something on the right. So this is a new kind of failure that is outside the security model of a lot of the academic literature and hadn't really been seen in the wild before. And in particular, it's actually a completely different kind of failure from your usual sort of security vulnerability, because this was meant to be a different kind of system from your usual kind of secure system. It was meant to provide evidence that the election result was as described. And what we showed was that that evidence trail was actually unsound. Okay, so here's a summary of the first bug, the bug in the shuffle proof. So there's an implementation error, there's an error in the specification that gives a trapdoor in the system, which breaks verifiability of the shuffle. Exploit of the trapdoor is completely undetectable, and in particular, the transcript of a fake proof of a false claim is in fact indistinguishable from a transcript of a truthful proof of a honest shuffle. It's probably just a stupid mistake, but it's exactly the kind of stupid mistake that a malicious attacker would deliberately insert if they wanted to explain it away as a stupid mistake after they found it. We honestly don't know. I think it's probably just a stupid mistake. All right, so that's the shuffle proof. And I forgot to say about Switzerland. We were looking at this code because Swiss transparency laws mandated that this code must be openly available to public scrutiny months before the election. So we were looking in Switzerland at code that was intended to be used 6 months later. And so when we found this problem, nobody in Switzerland was enormously upset because that had been the whole point of opening it to public scrutiny in the first place. But e-voting is a global business. The vendor that sold this code to Switzerland also sold an internet voting system to the state of New South Wales, which is the next door state to me in Australia. And they were already using it. So they were already collecting votes in the early voting system for their election, which was going to complete on March the 23rd. This journalist has summed it up beautifully, in my opinion. He says, New South Wales Electoral Commission confirms iVote contains critical Scytl crypto defect, but declares it unaffected and safe for the upcoming election. Right? So we know it's fundamentally flawed, but we're going to use it anyway. They later said that the vendor had patched the system just before they decrypted. I think the differing fortunes of these two very similar voting systems have a lot to do with the laws in different countries. Switzerland, as I said, had a very strong set of transparency laws. It was mandated that a system that was seeking certification for use by up to 100% of voters must have open public scrutiny of the code and an open intrusion test into the system. New South Wales has exactly the opposite law, which I've pasted up here. It says, first of all, if you find out that the system doesn't protect privacy, you have to stay silent about it. It's not 100% clear whether you have to stay silent about the contents of the vote you uncovered or silent about the fact that you have uncovered it. Either way, the law says, the first bullet point here says you have to be silent about privacy problems, not that the system must satisfy some kind of privacy requirement. And then the second bullet point says not that there must be public scrutiny, but that if you share the source code without the Electoral Commissioner's permission, you can be jailed for 2 years. So before the election, the code was only available if you signed a non-disclosure agreement promising to keep your findings secret for 5 years. And this NDA was backed up by this law that you would go to jail for 2 years if you shared the source code. So I think this bad law is a direct contributor to the fact that New South Wales ran their broken system right up into a real election, and the Swiss didn't. Okay, good. So we fixed the bug, at least in Switzerland, they fixed the bug in time. So now everything is perfectly secure, right? We can run our internet voting system and everything will be fine. Except remember, the shuffle proof was a shuffle and decryption proof. And actually we found a bug in the decryption part as well. So I don't know how much of the audience are geek mathematical types and how much law and policy types. So I left the math out of the talk, but if you, for those who care about the math details, please go and read the paper, and questions are very welcome about that. But the bug related to the use of the Fiat-Shamir heuristic, which is a step in a proof that you have decrypted properly. Basically a step that allows you to sort of prove your own challenge. It turned out that this step was implemented wrongly, thus allowing a cheating prover to make up the claim that they had been making after they generated the proof for the truth of that claim. So you could kind of go most of the way through the proof and then go back and generate the ciphertext that matched with the proof that you had generated, and thus make a proof for a thing that was actually completely false. In the first case, I said that for the shuffle proof, the cheating would have been completely undetectable. In this second instance, it would have been informally obvious that something had gone wrong because the cheater didn't have complete freedom to choose a different decrypted vote. All they could do was choose some nonsense and claim that that was the proper decryption of something that had actually been a valid vote. So informally, it would have been obvious that something had gone wrong. Formally, however, it would have passed verification. It turned out that this bug affected not just decryption, but also some other things that had to be proved on the voters' side in the Swiss e-voting system. And that was actually a huge deal for the Swiss because that bug had been present in systems that they had already been using. And in that instance, it would have allowed a voting client to extract the confirmation codes that the Swiss voter was expecting. They have this kind of voter verification system where a code voting system where you cast a vote and then you get a code back, and then you can look at the piece of paper that you've received in the mail to see whether the code you get back corresponds to the code on your paper sheet that indicates that that choice was properly received by the authorities. It turned out that this bug actually undermined that process in systems that had already been used for Swiss election results that had already been accepted. And that was a huge deal for Switzerland because it showed that their existing assurance processes had failed, and it showed that they had a bunch of election results that could possibly have been manipulated within their security model. Although, as I said, informally, it probably would have been evident. It certainly wasn't. The detection of the problem was not something that had specifically been being looked for. So this was potentially very serious. And this has received a lot of press, a lot of attention, and a lot of open public discussion in Switzerland. This is the Swiss Federal Chancellor, and I think my French isn't great, but I think failure considerable means serious failure of the electronic voting system. So in Switzerland, there's been a considerable rethink of the e-voting system, and e-voting hasn't run again since these discoveries. I don't know whether it will restart, but at the moment it's on hold. So what about in New South Wales? So remember I said these two systems were sold by the same vendor. It was overwhelmingly likely that this second problem would affect the New South Wales system too. By now, by the way, we're getting close to actual election day in New South Wales. So when the news about this second problem became public, the New South Wales Electoral Commission put out this press release that said, we know there's some other thing that affects the Swiss system, but we're confident that the new issue is not relevant to the iVote system. This was profoundly implausible, right? They had to have a decryption proof. They bought their decryption proof from the same vendor. It seemed highly unlikely that this was true, but of course it was impossible to prove because we didn't have the code. Eventually, many months after the election, they did make the code available under a reasonable non-disclosure agreement that said you had to be silent for 45 days. I looked at the code and it was immediately evident that, of course, it was relevant, but there had been no way to demonstrate that during the election. Okay, so let's have a look. So I think the first lesson is that good regulations make a huge difference. So these two systems were basically equivalent. If anything, the Swiss system was a little bit better, but the Swiss bugs were found faster and actually got a lot more attention and have a much better chance of being fixed because the Swiss transparency regulations brought them to light. So Swiss rules on e-voting are very detailed. Probably if they had stronger requirements for openness earlier, they probably would have found this problem earlier before they'd actually used the systems. New South Wales was just lucky, right? Just sheer good luck that the foreign company they bought their voting system from also sold it into a country with transparency laws. If that piece of sheer good luck hadn't happened, they probably never would have even known. They ran their broken system right through a real election. It took 5% of the vote in their state election, by the way. And they don't seem on a trajectory to improve it because it didn't get any significant attention during the election because they denied that there was a problem during the election. Okay, so the summary here is this is yet another instance of finding a completely new thing that we didn't even think about that can go wrong with internet voting. And in response to a request, I have made a long list of all the other things that could potentially go wrong that we really didn't even think about as we were writing our fancy cryptographic papers about internet voting systems. We've got some pretty good protocols that allow computers to vote securely and verifiably over the internet. But for humans who can't do public key operations in their heads, we really have a problem that we really haven't solved. Here's a list of things that I know have gone wrong. So first of all, receipt freeness is really hard. So this is the property is defined as the absence of the option to prove how you voted. But in fact, basically, although in the literature there are in principle some systems that do have receipt freeness and make it hard to prove how you voted, basically everything fielded in practice makes it easy to prove how you voted. It's relatively easy to prove how you voted in Switzerland, New South Wales, and in Estonia, and in the Helios internet voting system that's used in IACR elections. And although, interestingly enough, the Swiss are very, very, very concerned about privacy in various ways. They really care about the secret ballot. They really care about hiding who has participated in which parts of the election. They don't really seem to mind so much that you can prove how you voted. Whereas to me, I think that that's actually a hugely serious potential problem, especially as it affects inappropriate influence by some people on some other people, right? The secret ballot was originally introduced in Australia over concern that working class men would be unduly influenced by their landlords or their boss to vote in a certain way. And I don't think, and we've widened the franchise and it's not just about working class men anymore, but I think the fundamental issue still very, very much applies, that if people who are in a relatively powerless situation can prove how they voted, then that opens the door to coercion and vote buying in a way that could actually be incredibly serious over the internet. So if anything, I think that the vote privacy issues associated with voting over the internet are actually at least as serious as the vote manipulability issues. Voter authentication of the internet is really, really hard. Australia, like the United States, completely lacks any kind of centralized government ID system. Even in countries that do have that centralized government ID system, you're obviously trusting the government or the company or whoever administers and organizes that centralized ID system to look after voter authentication. Even in Estonia, which has a relatively well-organized such system, there's a kind of recent paper by the organizers of the Estonian internet voting system saying that they regard that as the weakest link. In Australia, there's just nothing we could even use, even plausibly. And I imagine the same is true in the United States. Until the Swiss thing, the thing that I would have actually said was hardest about secure internet voting is the step in which the voter sitting at home or using their own device checks for themselves that the vote they're casting accurately reflects their intentions. We have a fair idea how to do voter verification in a polling place by giving people a chance to look at a piece of paper. We even have some more sophisticated kind of fancy cryptographic methods for showing people that they're casting an electronic vote in a polling place in the way that they intend. But we really don't have a good way of doing this over the internet at all. And we have like I said, the Swiss system is based on codes. The Estonian system and the Helios system are based on you make a ciphertext, and then you kind of ask for the ciphertext to be opened and to show you the randomness that was used to generate the ciphertext. And then you take that evidence to a different device, and you ask a second device to double check the computation that's been done by the voting device, and so on. It kind of works, but it's really clunky. And I think in practice, most ordinary voters wouldn't do it. The Swiss code-based option is a lot more convenient and a lot more doable, but it's also based on significant trust assumptions, because if anybody finds your code sheet, they can subvert that process for you. So we don't have even a suggestion for voter verification that is easy enough for real normal people to do and doesn't involve unacceptable trust assumptions. Another thing that I actually found out about the Swiss voting system, which mirrored my experience in an e-voting project that I worked on in Victoria for polling place end-to-end verifiable voting, is that it's one thing to write a nice cryptographic paper with a lovely, carefully designed protocol that distributes trust among a series of entities. It's actually an entirely different thing to implement real separation of responsibility. So the Swiss electoral rules and the specification of the system said there were supposed to be 4 mixing servers and various other kinds of control components. And the protocol was supposed to have the property that as long as they weren't all under the control of the same, as long as they didn't all collude together, then various security and privacy properties would hold. Except, of course, they're all implemented by the same company. They're all administered by the same people. They're all sitting in the same room. The ease of controlling all 4 of them is actually not significantly harder than controlling any one of them. So the assumption might have been okay and the design might have been okay, but in practice, that separation wasn't there. Exactly the same thing happened in the VVote project in the state of Victoria that I worked on. Another thing that has been said by lots of other people, but I think has really been brought home this year in the United States, is that I don't mean to insult electoral officials in any way. I just mean to say that the attack surface of these systems is such that you have to assume that the person selling the software, the person administering the software, the person who cleans out the room in which the computers are sitting, the current political leader of the country, the boss of the people running the software company, and all of these people are potentially working with the adversary. And as a security problem, we have to assume that none of these parts of the system are trustworthy, because if they were trustworthy, they'd become a point for undetectable manipulation. To keep going down my list of things that might go wrong, what if the authorities just don't tell people properly how to verify? So in principle, if you read a cryptographic paper about election verification, it sounds like everybody automatically knows how to do their verification. In practice, those verification instructions have to come from somewhere, and in practice, they tend to come from the same authority that's administering the system and giving people the software. So what if the authorities just don't tell people properly how to run the verification algorithm? This actually happened in a project that I worked on, which was the VVote project in Victoria, which is based on the Preta-Vote electronic voting system. And it's a pre-printed paper ballot with some plain text and some cryptographic artifacts on it. And people are supposed to audit the paper printouts in order to get confidence that the paper printouts are well formed. The Electoral Commission refused to tell people even to bother trying, and their argument was, well, we'll just tell people to trust it. Why would we encourage distrust by telling people to audit? I still haven't finished. Even if they're told to verify, people often don't, and of course this applies to BMDs and VVPATs as well. There's a kind of brittleness, I think, associated with purely cryptographic solutions, because it's basically impossible to design a cryptographic protocol that is robust against bugs in that cryptographic protocol. And I think this is very well illustrated by the problems in the Swiss system that we've just seen. There was also a privacy problem in the Norwegian internet voting system that really kind of broke the protection of the votes. People trust what they shouldn't is really the bottom line, especially in New South Wales, I think. People trust what they shouldn't until one day they don't. One day they go looking for an evidence trail and realise that it really isn't there. Okay, so a lot of people have observed, and I think you're right, that this year in the United States is kind of the worst possible year for trying to run an election. That's why I think the best designs are things like Election Guard or Star Vote that are really genuinely robust. So these are systems that combine a paper record, some statistical auditing, and some of the cryptographic evidence trail that gives you some proof that your vote was properly included. So you vote in a polling place, you see your paper ballot go into the official box, and also you get some opportunity for cryptographic verification later. This kind of robustness is necessary, I think. But I really want to go back to that picture of the much greener United States in 2020 and say, I think we're going to have a peaceful transfer of power, even in the most chaotic and difficult situation in a century, at least I hope it is, even with a leader who doesn't accept that they lost. And that actually is the attacker model that a well-run election has to defend against, because if your democracy doesn't withstand the worst test that it's had in a century, then your democracy isn't going to last more than a century, right? Your democracy has lasted more than 200 years. My democracy is more than 150 years old. It's got to take the attack, the worst, it's got to pass the worst situation in a century. And I think that as a result of the very hard work that many people have done on US elections, it is going to pass. But that didn't happen automatically, right? Imagine if 5% of the votes in Pennsylvania had come off an internet voting system as broken as iVote. Or imagine if we were looking at this claimed election result that we see this year, but the verifier map looked as much of a mess as it did in 2006, and such a large fraction of those votes were coming in from states with no evidence trail at all. I think it's going to be okay because so many people have put so much work into building the evidence trail that's necessary in order to defend an election system against the most chaotic year that we've had for a long time. So my current favorite problem, just to return to the technical side, is adapting some kind of paper plus cryptography verification to a remote setting, so as to get something no worse than postal voting with some evidence about proper inclusion, right? Postal voting isn't great. It's not as bad as paperless DREs, but it's not great. And I think we could potentially think about combining some of the cryptography with some of the simple paper evidence to improve that process. Okay, I'm going to end my talk with something that really profoundly irritates me. This is a bit of a meme, which I don't know whether you've seen in the United States. It's certainly a common meme in Australia, even among young people who have grown up in a democracy. This is an article from the South China Morning Post in 2018, and it says, Xi's world or Trump's, the choice is between prosperous authoritarianism or chaotic freedom in the new Cold War. So this is a common meme which basically characterizes democracy as kind of chaotic. You can have your freedom and your democracy thing as long as you're willing to live with chaos, or you can have a nice, peaceful, prosperous, authoritarian system, and you just have to put up with not being able to browse the internet quite as freely as you might like. You go and ask somebody under 25, and I bet you'll find that they have heard this argument, which I assume is a very deliberate piece of the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda machine. I assume I'm preaching to the choir if I say this is about as profoundly offensive as it is possible to get, primarily because authoritarian regimes in practice, including this one, tend to be extremely violent. But it's also completely wrong about democracy, actually, democracy and chaos, because democracy is actually the very precise opposite of a chaotic system. It is actually not highly dependent on arbitrary initial conditions. It is, in fact, inherently self-correcting. That's the whole point, right? You might elect, it's not a question of which of these two men is the better leader. It's the question of which of them it's easier to get rid of when you realize you've made a mistake. And a democracy properly defended by evidence-based elections is the opposite of chaos. It is, in fact, the ultimate self-correcting system. And I'm so proud of so many of my friends in the United States who have worked to build the evidence trail necessary to get the peaceful transfer of power that I'm confident you're going to get. Okay, I'm going to stop there and open to questions.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. We'll take questions from the Q&A window, and then if you get a chance, you can paste those links into the Q&A. The first question is from Ross. Does the threat model or confidence change when a majority of votes are submitted by mail as opposed to in person?
Well, all other things being equal, vote by mail is definitely not as good as voting in person. But if I was going to manipulate, so just back to this verifier, back to these two maps, right? Yes, it is possible to commit fraud by postal mail. And in fact, we've had an instance of vote by mail fraud here in Melbourne quite recently. But so voting on a piece of paper in a polling place is better than voting by mail. But voting by mail is better than voting on a unverifiable electronic machine in a polling place, because the opportunity for a very small conspiracy to commit a very large amount of fraud, if everybody is just voting on an electronic machine without any kind of evidence trail, is actually a lot greater, I think, than it would be by post. It's not impossible by post. It just requires a large conspiracy of people, and there's a fair chance of getting caught. Whereas with a DRE, it requires one janitor.
Right. So here's a couple of related questions. More generally, how do we avoid the huge amount of lies and false information online misleading voters in future elections? And what's the best way to encourage more voter participation and increase voter confidence in our election system?
Wow. Okay, those are very good questions. The first question I really don't know. I would like to see better privacy law and better transparency law. So I think one of the nastiest things I've seen in recent times is Facebook trying to block a set of researchers who are trying to basically examine Facebook's targeting algorithm, right? And look at what people were seeing and try and understand how it was working. I would love to see real transparency. I would love to see the opposite of that, right? I would love to see some real transparency from those companies about who sees what and under what circumstances it's targeted at them, and at least give us an opportunity to understand what's going wrong. I would also like to see some decent privacy law. Australia doesn't have one. I gather that California does and the EU does. I'd be really interested to see whether that at least impedes a little bit the opportunity to target very specific, very nasty stuff at some people that flies under the radar. I don't know. So I don't know the answer to the first question. The second question was, how can we encourage more people to engage in democracy and encourage more people to verify and be included? Again, I think this this actually varies a lot from one democracy to another, interestingly. And it's very different in Australia from what it is in the United States. We vote on Saturdays, and our voting is compulsory. So you get a $50 fine if you don't vote. And this produces turnout of often above 95%, which is if you think of it in an American way, it's an artificially inflated 95%, right? It's people who, in many cases, didn't actually want to bother, but who bothered so that they didn't get a fine. I like it. I recognize it would never fly in the United States, but it works for me and it works for most Australians, I think. And it tends to be fun. You know, it's on a Saturday. It tends to be easy. It's a nice little community event. We show up at the local primary school and stand in a queue. So that works. You could have the Saturday voting or the weekend voting without the compulsion. You could...
In the US, there's been some movement to that in various ways with early vote centers.
Mm-hmm. That seems like a positive development to me, you know, making it easy for people to vote. Honestly, it makes me cry when I see people standing in a queue for 8 hours trying to vote, right? I don't think there's much, it doesn't look to me as an outsider as if very much more encouragement is needed in the United States. It looks to me like what's needed is opportunity. If the 8 hour long lines didn't exist, then that would provide much better opportunity for much more people to vote.
All right, let's move on to the next question. You talked about evidence that convinces losers of elections or their supporters, but these people are probably not election verification experts. What kinds of evidence would be convincing both to experts and non-experts? Or what kind of evidence is convincing to one and not the other?
Yeah, this is a really, really good question, actually. And this criticism has been made, particularly of the cryptographic methods of election verification, which is to say, well, you know, you came up with this fancy math, but nobody else understands it. Why should we believe you? And that is an entirely valid criticism. And in fact, the other side of that coin is people trusting broken math, right? Trusting this sort of, oh no, don't worry, there's a mathematical proof, but you can't see it, and we don't need to bother explaining it to you. So I think that question, if we don't have a satisfactory answer to that question, and I'm not sure we do, it's a very good argument for the simplest kind of paper-based systems. I have to say I'm less worried about people trusting or not trusting the statistical arguments. Maybe it's just because it's not my thing, so I'm less suspicious of it because it's not my field. But I think everybody can understand why the paper ballots form an evidence trail. And it doesn't particularly bother me that only a small fraction of people can really go through the math that supports a risk limiting audit, because I think most people would be pretty happy to accept a non-rigorous kind of an audit anyway. They just like the idea that there's checking. So the combination of this thing that looks good with a thing that is actually mathematically rigorous is a pretty powerful combination.
All right. And for the last two questions, and then we'll wrap it up. In practice, for the decryption bug to be exploited in the Swiss election system, would the margin need to be very small so that even informally it could not be detected? Does it depend on the size of the actual true margin?
So it's a bug that would have allowed an attacker to turn a valid vote into nonsense that would not be counted. So the number of funny looking nonsense votes that popped out at the end are the number that had been manipulated. And if you actually wanted to change the outcome on any particular race, you would have to do that to more than the margin. So obviously, if the margin was very small, you'd only end up with a small number of funny looking nonsense votes. But if the margin was very large, you'd obviously have to do it to more things. I don't know in practice whether that would affect the likelihood of detection, but I assume it would.
All right. And the very last question, someone asks, a worry that I have with open source code, even if random people cannot change it, is that it makes security flaws obvious. Capture the
That's
fact
why I like it.
hacked poll machines and major websites. So I fear they could hack online voting too.
So I think what the Swiss New South Wales thing demonstrates unequivocally is that you cannot keep your source code secret, right? Even if you write a law that says it has to be secret or 2 years jail, and you write an NDA that says you have to keep it secret for 5 years if we showed it to you, even under those circumstances, the same code is being sold in a different country that has a transparency law instead. It is just, you are not keeping your code secret, even if you think you are. So you might as well invite honest people to tell you what's wrong with it, because then you've got a chance of fixing it.
All right. Thank you very much, Vanessa. Let's thank the audience for their good questions, and we will conclude this seminar. We will leave the Q&A window open for a bit more.
And I will post my links in the chat.